On the 24th of March 1603, inside the walls of Richmond Palace, the final Tudor monarch died inside of her bedchamber. Elizabeth I was considered one of the greatest queens ever to rule over England, as she defeated the Spanish Armada, oversaw huge amounts of cultural change, and also managed to deal with her enemies ruthlessly. Elizabeth was the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the ill-fated second wife of Henry VIII, who lost her head inside of the Tower of London, and at one point it was believed that she would never become queen. But in reality, she was the most successful of Henry VIII's children when it came to the kingdom that she ruled over. This was reflected in Elizabeth I's funeral, and a huge procession took place to Westminster Abbey. But on top of the funeral cortege and the coffin was a huge effigy of Elizabeth I, and for most of the people in London who saw her coffin that day, the effigy was the first glimpse they caught of their queen. But what was the story of her funeral effigy, and does it survive today? Elizabeth I's final years were plagued by heartbreaking deaths of her closest advisers and her friends. She struggled to name a successor as she had no children in the event of her death, and Robert Cecil took the decision to enter secret negotiations with the King of Scotland, James VI, who would, following her death, become also James I of England. James's words regarding the succession pleased Elizabeth, and she was rather satisfied with her successor, even if he was the son of Elizabeth's executed nemesis, Mary, Queen of Scots. Elizabeth's health was relatively decent until 1602, and a number of close deaths of her friends resulted in the Queen becoming very depressed. It got to the point where Elizabeth began to appear in a trance-like state, as she would sit motionless for many hours, and she appeared to be coming to terms with her final days and months. She snapped at her close advisers, but on the 24th of March 1603, inside of Richmond Palace, Elizabeth I died at roughly 2 in the morning. Her death broke the hearts of the English and her people, and her plans were then drawn up for the huge funeral. Queen Elizabeth I's body lay in state at Richmond for a number of days until it travelled downstream to the Palace of Whitehall. Her coffin was draped in velvet and was watched every night by 6 ladies. It was claimed that the Queen did come to Whitehall by water. The oars at every stroke did tears let fall. There were rumours at this time about a large crack being heard from the coffin, and that the body of the Queen broke open from the pressure of the gases as her corpse was expelling the gas and her remains were decaying. This explosion was said to have been so loud and violent that it splintered the wood lead and the cerecloth. On the 28th of April 1603, Queen Elizabeth I's funeral took place, and this was a huge procession from Whitehall to Westminster Abbey. Her body was taken down Whitehall, and a huge procession of hundreds took place. Poor men and women and many courtiers were involved, along with many members of Elizabeth's household, knights, squires, and other members of the nobility. It was said that the city of Westminster was subcharged with a multitude of all sorts of people in the streets, houses, lids, and gutters that came to see the obsequies. There was such a general sighing, groaning, and weeping as the like has not been seen or known in the memory of man. The coffin continued to process towards Westminster Abbey for the funeral service and burial, and the resting on top of Elizabeth I's coffin was a lifelike effigy of her. This was, for the first time they had seen any image of their queen. It was documented that this funeral effigy was dressed in the Parliament robes that Elizabeth wore, and that it was her whole body. On top of the effigy's head was also a crown, and in her hands was the sceptre indicating power. This life-sized effigy was made from wax and had been made for many years, and it showed the Queen in her youth in the way that the portraits of her show, much younger than her actual years. The coffin was pulled towards Westminster Abbey by 4 horses draped in black, and a canopy was placed over the hearse. Elizabeth's funeral service took place inside of the Abbey, and her body was then, following this, deposited in the vault of her grandfather Henry VII and her grandmother Elizabeth of York. The original funeral effigy of Elizabeth was made by John Colt, and this was carried on her hearse. Later, in 1760, for some reason, probably due to the fact it was decaying heavily, and in a state it was remade and was fitted with a new wax head and outer clothes. However, the original corset from the 1603 effigy of Elizabeth I does still exist, and this is the only part of it that remains. There were allegedly 2 bodies of the 1603 effigy that were made to be used, and it was claimed that an effigy representing Her late Majesty, with a pair of straight bodies, was created, and this was probably made by the Queen's tailor, William Jones. These bodies were adorned with corsets made by the Queen's tailor, and they were based on what she had previously made for her. 2 were ordered, as one would be used for the Queen to wear, and, morosely, the other would be used for the effigy following her death. These corsets were designed to fit the tall Queen, but in reality it's considered that the corsets were incredibly small for an adult woman. In 1995, the effigy of Elizabeth I that was inside of Westminster Abbey was unclothed for study, and the corset and drawers were found. They were contemporary, and these are the only pieces of the effigy that have survived. The corset laced up at the form with 29 small eyelets on either side, and it was edged with fine leather, and originally was apple green in colour. The cloth corset for the effigy was similar to ones made of Elizabeth's own pattern, such as the one she wears in the rainbow portrait. This piece of clothing is today on display inside of Westminster Abbey's Diamond Jubilee galleries above the Abbey's floor. It is believed that the funeral effigy of Elizabeth I did inspire and help sculptors to create her tomb and monument inside of Westminster Abbey. Following James I's seizure of the throne and succession, he ordered a huge marble tomb to be created for the final Tudor monarch, and this was to be placed above the very site where Elizabeth I's half-sister Mary, or Bloody Mary, as she is more commonly known, was buried. With this, Elizabeth's body was later moved and was interred inside of the new vault, and the tomb of the effigy of her in marble shows the Queen wearing a large ruff and a tight corset, and holds in her hand the orb and sceptre, similar to the image of her that those people saw at her funeral in 1603. It's most probable that the effigy was used to create a lifelike stone monument to her, and still today Elizabeth I is buried inside of the vault directly on top of the coffin of her half-sister Mary I, showing her significance over her. Elizabeth I was a brilliant and remarkable queen who changed many things in England. Her reign saw a burst of literature and culture, and when she died the majority of people across her nation were upset and heartbroken. The funeral procession of her was huge and rivalled that of her father Henry VIII, but the effigy on top of the coffin was for most the first time that the public had seen what their queen looked like. They did not have access to portraits of her, and neither did they see images of her in newspapers, so as the coffin of the Queen passed down Whitehall, many looked at her effigy as the symbol of the deceased monarch in all of her power and might. Thank you for watching, and to support, please make sure to subscribe. And again, thank you so much for watching.